Hi, this is your buddy Quinn. Welcome to the video introduction to M by director Fritz Lang. M is a film that was filmed in Germany, in Berlin, in 1931. Uh, this film also marks the transition in our series from silent films to sound films. M is the first thriller in our series, and the first film that I know that is about a serial killer. For that reason, M has had enormous influence on the chase down and on the criminal genre, of which there are now thousands of films. The film is available on YouTube as well as on Canopy, or can be rented to stream on Amazon as well. If you watched the earlier film introduction to Metropolis, you already know something about the context of this film. Metropolis was a film from 1927 in Germany. This is a film 1931 in Germany. And it's actually by the same director, Fritz Lang. Just like Metropolis, M was also co-written with his wife, Thea von Harbu. I hesitated in this series to include two films from the same director, but in this particular case, I think it's justified for a few reasons. First of all, M is a very different film than Metropolis. It's different in style, it's different in genre. It's also a sound film, and the 4-year gap between the two films is actually quite a significant period in German history, as it represents the final days of the Weimar Republic. The Nazis are going to come to power in Germany just 2 years later, 1933, and the political environment in 1931, when M was released, was becoming very, very polarized. And I think that's reflected to some extent in the mood and tone of the film. This is a film about a very difficult topic. It's about a serial killer of children. The film itself doesn't depict violence per se, but the theme is quite dark because of the topic, and it may not be a good film for young viewers for that reason. In 1930-31, Germany was actually experiencing a spate of serial killers in various cities and around the country, including one very prominent killer of young children. And so the topic and theme of M is one that would have resonated very well with viewers who were dealing with this in various parts of Germany. M in the title stands for the German word murder, which is murderer in English. And the theme, I think, reflects a general sense of fear for what is happening in society at the time. Fritz Lang certainly was feeling some of that with the rise of National Socialism and the Nazi Party being part Jewish, and one of the principal actors in this film is also Jewish. And so there's a sense that society is disintegrating a little bit and is becoming a bit more violent. Fritz Lang had done some crime-related drama before, and as a result, he actually ended up having a good relationship with the Commissar of Police in Berlin. And he used the connections that he had with the police department to do a significant amount of research prior to directing this film. He did ethnographic research on serial killers and on psychopaths. He was actually able to interview a number of Germany's most prominent serial killers before directing the film, including one killer of children. Many people think that this is the person on whom the details of the film are loosely based. He did, as noted in his biography, do 8 days of field research in a mental hospital, specifically trying to understand the psychology of someone who would become a serial killer. This film is also Lang's second to last film in Germany. He ends up fleeing the Nazis shortly after this. He divorces his wife, who is a Nazi sympathizer. And the film, released in 1931, is actually banned just a couple of years later, early 1934, by the Nazis when they come to power. They ban it for a couple of reasons. It's due in part to potential illusions that were suggested that the film was actually about polarization and violence increasing in society, symbolically highlighting the Nazi threat of violence against society. although prominent Nazi Joseph Goebbels actually remarked on the film, he liked aspects of the film in particular because it was free of what he called humanitarian sentiments. Fritz Lang also thought that this was the best film that he made. But because the Nazis came to power right afterward, it was stored in a vault beginning in 1934, wasn't allowed to be publicly screened, and wasn't screened again for more than 30 years. So it didn't make a reappearance out of that vault until 1966 when it was restored. For more information on director Fritz Lang and on Thea von Harbou, I want to refer you back to the introduction to Metropolis, where I discussed the director in more detail. There are several things that make this particular film special, things that I want you to be aware of before you watch it. First of all, it does have a plot, right? And there's even some suspense in the film. And I think as a result, it will appear as an older film, certainly, but I think it makes it interesting even for contemporary viewers. It is, in addition to being a thriller, really a psychological drama. And so some of the fast-paced editing in contemporary thrillers is missing in this film. Many of the scenes are a bit more drawn out. And many of the scenes in particular of discussions about how to deal with the serial killer might seem a little bit long to contemporary taste, but they represent some of the important dialogue that I think Fritz Lang is making commentary on when he talks about German society at the time. There are some echoes of Metropolis from several years prior in terms of its use of German expressionism. Film is about individual madness, which we do see in Lang's earlier films. In this case, it's the madness of a killer. And the film is also about social fear, or fear of an unknown threat from others. And I think that this aspect of the film is particularly resonant in an era of coronavirus, right? Where people feel like they need to keep their distance from others because of an unknown fear that stalks society, right? That could be dangerous to them. This is a theme that's quite prominent in the first half of the film, where people feel forced to have a general suspicion of others because no one knows who the killer is. In the second half of the film, when society decides that they really need to do something about this persistent fear and disruption, there are several attempts at social cooperation to solve this problem. And these attempts involve different parts of society that often would be at odds with one another. There's a beggars syndicate that's involved in the film. This is based on the actual beggars syndicate in Berlin at the time. The beggars were actually organized into a little bit of a union. There's an underground criminal mafia that is also depicted in the film, which reflects much of organized crime in Germany at the time. They decide to work together to solve this problem. And then there are various levels of police and security agents depicted in the film that are all trying to solve the problem. So fear, certainly in the first part of the film, begins to turn to an appetite for solutions as the film goes on. Another thing that makes this film quite special is how it straddles the silent and the sound era of early film. So remember that the technology to develop sound on film is developed in 1928, and it takes a little while to adopt that technology. In fact, by the time director Fritz Lang made this film, sound technology was available, but it was very expensive. And so partly due to cost considerations, he actually shot the film 2/3 in sound and 1/3 silently. The silent parts of the film are actually interspersed in the film with the sound part. So when dialogue is necessary, sound is used. And then for other parts where physical movement is more important, it turns to silence. This again was done primarily for cost considerations, but Fritz Lang was actually quite happy with the juxtaposition of silence and sound. Because it added a little bit more to the eeriness of what he was trying to do. And I think really as we try to understand the strengths of silent film and the strengths of sound film, this is a really important bridge film because we get to see how sound plays a part in the plot, and also how silent film is used to increase tension in the film. Particularly important, though, really is the way that Fritz Lang uses sound and experiments with it in making this film a stronger film because of it. One way that he does that is that there is a tune in the film that is regularly whistled. And that tune becomes associated with the killer. In other words, we can hear the tune, and then we can recognize that the killer is around, even though we might not see him. He might be off screen. So this is what is known as a leitmotif. A leitmotif was used often in opera for a long time prior to this, but this was one of the first times this has ever been used in film. The particular tune that is whistled here is Edvard Grieg's in the Hall of the Mountain King. And because the main actor who plays the killer was not able to whistle, Fritz Lang himself actually did the whistling off screen, but it would be attributed in the film and in the plot to the killer. We also see Lang use sound in ways to depict things that are out of shot, all right, or off the screen. He is experimenting in some scenes as well. For example, there's a scene early in the film where a child is bouncing a ball, and the sound of that bouncing ball is quite haunting, right? And does things to increase tension in the plot that we would not be able to do with a silent film. Another thing that I think is really lovely and interesting about this film is that we get the breakthrough performance of actor Peter Lorre. Peter Lorre's real name is actually Laszlo Lowenstein, right? We learned a couple of things from that name. First of all, he was actually Hungarian. He was not German. And he was Jewish. Being a Hungarian Jew working in Berlin in the early 1930s was kind of a tenuous affair. He did have a stage career in Vienna before he went to Berlin to work in film. And right after this film, Peter Lorre is going to flee Germany. He's going to flee the Nazis. He ends up getting some work in England. He actually plays a very important role for Alfred Hitchcock during the English period of Hitchcock in The Man Who Knew Too Much. He then moves to Hollywood, and he gets some prominent roles in some very famous early Hollywood films, including The Maltese Falcon and Casablanca in the 1940s. This film really made Lorre as an actor, but it also had the effect of typecasting him as a bit of a creepy villain. And he came to regret aspects of that. I think he does a really striking job of playing the role of a psychotic in this film, and it justifiably makes him a star. But he doesn't have a great relationship with the director, Fritz Lang, during the film. Lang was notorious for the way he treated his actors and actresses, roughed them up a lot, even threw Peter Lorre down the stairs multiple times in this film. And as a result, after both Lorre and Lang moved to Hollywood, and Lang later wanted to make another film with Peter Lorre, Lorre refused because of the relationship that he had with the director during the filming of M. It wasn't a long time that this was filmed. It was only about a 6-week filming period, but it left a negative impression by Peter Lorre on the director. I think also, if you extend the definition of the genre of film noir far enough, this is a genre that's going to become very prominent in Hollywood in the late 1930s to the 1950s, that you might consider that M to be really the first major breakthrough in the film noir genre. You'll want to watch out for aspects of German expressionism, which we've seen before, mingled with some attention to realism and attention to faces and detail that we saw realistically depicted in The Passion of Joan of Arc. So light, shadow, interesting camera angles, common in German expressionism are all still quite important in this film. The final trial scene of the film, I think, is also particularly interesting. I won't discuss it now because it is worth watching how we get there in the film. But one interesting item of note is that Lang wanted, in the spirit of realism, to bring in people off the streets, and he brought in a bunch of real criminals to play a role in the filming of this trial scene. Uh, Interestingly, over the course of the filming, just in several days of that trial scene, the police ended up arresting 24 of Lang's extras who were real criminals there. If you happen to see The Passion of Joan of Arc, which was the previous film in this series, you may want to pay particular attention to the comparison of the trial scenes of Joan of Arc and then of the killer toward the end of this film, which I think teaches a lot about both the importance and dangers of social conformity. In both cases, the trial is irregular and perhaps not entirely fair, but I'd like you to compare those two things. Some people think, who are more well versed in film than I am, that this is the most influential German film in film history, as well as the first real masterpiece of the sound era. A few themes to watch out for. Uh, and I think this film raises some interesting questions along these themes. One is, how should society deal with psychopaths, right? How should it treat them? Should it kill them, execute them, put them away for life? Should it try to reform them? You may recall from early American literature, Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote a famous book called The Scarlet Letter, in which, after committing a sin, the protagonist is forced to wear a letter, right, embroidered into her clothing. And there's a parallel in this film using the letter M that I'd like you to reflect on a little bit. What does it mean to brand someone as a murderer? And how should this be resolved by society? Another theme that I think is interesting is thinking about the various ways in which different parts of society that are often treated as outcasts might make meaningful contributions or might be able to um, add something to social dilemmas that they're often not consulted on. So, can beggars or criminals actually make a positive contribution to society? Are there opportunities for collaboration rather than simply confrontation with those folks? So, just a couple of themes to think through. I hope that you enjoy this film. I hope that you will feel a little bit of the way that suspense is beginning to be crafted in the early sound period. Directors like Alfred Hitchcock are going to take this to a next level. But Fritz Lang really does some remarkable things, playing with sound, playing with suspense, to make this a particularly interesting film to watch.